suppose the title of this conference, Making the Case, is really, for me, is where it's at. Certainly speaking on behalf of my own party, because we are talking about social housing reform, and that means reforming the structures where that needs to be done. And I want to talk about that in a wee minute. But for me, first of all, I'd like to thank Cameron and thank the Federation for giving myself, on behalf of my own party, the opportunity to be here this afternoon. And I'm very, very conscious of the fact that the room is full of housing experts. So I will stand forgiven if I get anything wrong. And obviously, when we have some questions and answers, I have no doubt you'll be putting some very interesting and hopefully challenging questions to myself and indeed the other panel members. I think, going back to Jim's opening remarks, I think what's important to recognise is that the mandate that the Minister has, Minister McCausland, from the Executive, is to explore a programme of social housing reform. There isn't any actual agreement, and Jim has pointed this out, as to what an outcome may be, because precisely what we're saying to people is, okay, there's a couple of main drivers for this coming at the Executive. And the one would be, first one obviously would have been the whole question around British Government Treasury rules, which actually state all sorts of restrictions on public borrowing. From the Executive's point of view, and certainly from my own party's point of view, fundamental to all of this is about the need to deliver more social housing for those who need that social housing. And that will be a fundamental principle that we will bring to any discussions. I think it's important, and I would refer to Cameron's own remarks about the need for his organisation, your organisation, as a key stakeholder to have a voice. And I would say, and I obviously very much appreciate the opportunity to represent my own party here today, but this is a matter for all parties. It's a matter for all of the key stakeholders, right through from the Housing Executive currently as a body, to the political parties, to other societal organisations and trade unions who represent fairly significant size of a workforce working in current housing structures as we speak. And of course, not least, and it has been referred to routinely through all of the contributions so far that I've heard, is that the whole role and the participation and the rights of tenants. Because clearly that's what we are all here collectively to serve, is to serve their interests. So for me, certainly, I very much welcome the opportunity that the Executive has given to the Minister, and the Minister made a case to the Executive for a need to do such an overhaul or a review. And I certainly welcome the opportunity, and I do think it does present us with an opportunity to look at the provision for social housing from a fresh perspective. Clearly, the Housing Executive has been in role now for decades, and that has been, for the most part, a very considerably positive role. I would have to say, as a representative in West Belfast for many, many years, going back, although I'm currently, for the last 10, 11 years, a representative of South Belfast, West Belfast was one area, like many others, which was drastically in need of major regeneration. Demolition was on the radar for many of those communities, right from Divis right up to Moyard and elsewhere, right across into the Shankle Road community. So I would say that my direct experience as representative was that in the early days, it wasn't automatically taken that all of those slum dwellings would be demolished. There was a long, hard campaign fought in most of those areas. But the point I would make is that once the decision and the political will was settled upon to do a massive regeneration programme about reforming the structures, not only reforming the structures, more importantly, building a building programme to meet the housing need, then the local Housing Executive, in my opinion, in my direct experience, at that point in time, once the political will at government level was taken to actually move ahead with a radical programme, that the local housing authorities really did step up to the mark. Work with communities, work with representatives to design new areas, to plan regeneration, to plan demolition, and so on. And I think a lot of communities learned an awful lot from that process. And I do believe, and I might speak a wee bit jealously from the West Belfast perspective, but I know it happened elsewhere, when those communities had those opportunities to work hand in glove with government departments and with housing managers and other people of that nature, those communities benefited tremendously because they learned an awful lot. So I believe that was one of the more empowering periods for local communities, certainly some of the communities that I would have had the privilege to represent. So I do think it's not just a nice thing to have tenants involved. I think it's a critically important thing to have tenants involved, because for us as a party, it's not just about providing homes, it's about building and sustaining communities, and I think that's very, very important. So certainly for my party's view, in the upcoming period, and Jim has outlined some of the time frames envisaged earlier on in his earlier slides and some of the phase by phase approach of this. We'll come at this from a point of view, we need to get more houses built for people who need them. And I have already commended the Housing Executive and other housing associations, for example, who also played very important roles in all of that over those early and sometimes very challenging years. But what is very, very, very important, we need to do that, as I've said, in a way which meets the need. And I would say, and some people may not always like to hear it, but notwithstanding the great work and the great strides that have taken place over many decades, we still have far too many areas which have an inequality of housing provision. Only have to get back into my own city in Belfast, well, areas like North Belfast, and I do appreciate, again, I want to put on the record, there are some steps being taken to redress that. Massive inequality in terms of the lack of provision of social housing for some communities as above others. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I don't want to be dealing in terms of communities. I want to deal on the basis of need for whoever a person or a family is. Their need has to have paramount importance, and that's why the common selection scheme or the point system, so on, would be very, very important elements of this. It is absolutely imperative that homes are allocated and built and provided for on the basis of need, and that will be an absolute sacrosanct requirement in terms of our own party. I've made it very, very clear on numerous occasions, and I've elapsed for 1 second in terms of in their role as a DSD committee chair in the Assembly. We as a committee unanimously have made it very clear to the Minister and to the Department we are very willing and look forward to working with the Department, and we've already begun to do some work around shaping out some of these proposals as we move forward. And in fact, we have as a committee adopted that kind of mantra that we want to see an overarching housing strategy which deals with the private sector, public housing and the housing associations. And all of that and each of those components all have a very major role to play. But we want to make sure we have an overarching strategy so that all of them, those components, can have the most constructive say. In other words, for maximum benefit of all the people out there who require homes and housing. So I think for me, again, certainly in our party's point of view, we would want to make sure that we continue that very positive engagement, albeit it will be a challenging one with the Department and with the Minister right through on into the Executive. So I look forward in the time ahead to having maximum consultation. And I say that because we all know there's one of those little elephants in the room which we don't often want to talk about, but housing has been one of the most contentious issues in our society for many, many years. Now, thankfully, over the last several years, that has been very much, if you like, diluted, the contentious nature of that, because of the housing structures that we have had in place. As I've said earlier on, I don't want to sort of gild the lily, we have not resolved all of our housing-related problems, but we have made giant strides. And I think what we need to do is to make sure that we build on the success of the past, not to ignore that or not to think that all our problems are solved. And I do think that housing is one of those issues that we all need to tread carefully. But I do think the maxim needs to be, we need to be open and we need to be transparent and we need to be thorough, and we need to challenge each other. So I think it is appropriate that the Housing Association movement would argue for a place at the table, wherever that may be, and I certainly in principle would support that. I do think all other members of our society need to have a well-informed say in as to how we move forward in terms of housing, because hopefully if we get the structures right moving forward in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, then we will set housing for the next number of decades in the way in which we have come through from the last. And I know Cabinet has referred to earlier on that 8 years or 10 years is not a long time, but nevertheless I think we can still look forward to planning for housing for the next 4 decades in the way in which we have learned lessons from the last 4. So for me, again, I just think on behalf of our own party, again, I do stress the absolute importance of everybody getting involved in this discussion. Yes, it has to be led, there has to be a programme, and there has to be a management and a programme of engagement, but that engagement does need to take place. And certainly our party's view would be, and we've made this clear, and I want to put a wee note of caution in the room today as well, because it's a caution to your own movement. I do think it's a wee bit unfortunate that we have too many people who, since the announcement earlier on in the year, in fact, I was surprised it was January that the announcement was made, Jim. Time flies an awful lot. But obviously that's quite a number of months since the announcements were made. I'm a wee bit disappointed and frustrated actually at times when I hear a narrative more behind the scenes, but sometimes it lapses into the public domain, that, you know, this will be all housing association, you know, from the time we get this new reform. The housing executive will be, sometimes people use the term gotten rid of. That's not a term I would certainly associate with. But some people would use that and maybe go into a more extreme of some of the kind of anecdotes that you hear. You know, the housing executive will be gotten rid of. It'll be 2, 3, 4, whatever the flavour of the month number of a housing association it might be. And in fact, going further, that the housing association movement here really doesn't have enough capacity, so it'll be people brought in from across the water. Now, I actually think that's quite a negative narrative. I think it's wrong. I think it's ill-informed. I think what, for me, and certainly representing my party, is, well, we have to move forward, as I've said, on an open and a transparent agenda, get the principles right, and I think the vision is right. We do need to make sure we're making adequate provision for social housing going forward in the next number of years, in a way in which it meets all of our needs, in a way in which all of the various components in the sector there at the moment can play a very positive and constructive and joined up role. And I think if we move forward on that open and transparent basis, then we'll have that discussion. And I do think we need to have all those discussions, as I said earlier on. So I think from our party's point of view, there will be a number of sort of core principles at the basis of all of our discussions. One, that we do need to make sure we're providing more social houses than we have been up until now, because quite simply we're not meeting the need. And I am worried when I see things like the way in which the housing development programme has not been used properly, in my view, this year. In fact, you know, we have had a number of underspends in each of the executives' monitoring rounds. I think that's been unfortunate, and that actually gives me cause for concern, because I believe, and the housing association movement, you're well aware, you have pointed out a number of examples where there are obstacles and difficulties in the way of whether it's procuring land, getting plan permission, and so on and so forth. You know better than I do. You have actually articulated a number of those concerns to the department. I think there's been some more work been done recently between the department and the housing association movement to look at what those obstacles may be. What I'm only interested in is how we remove those obstacles and solve those problems, and they need to be done sooner or later. So I'm just a bit concerned that when we look at a time frame around delivering social housing reform, one, that can actually put a bit of a paralysis on delivering the programme as we can today by removing obstacles that may well exist, and B, that the time frame continues on to slip, because 2017 is into the next Assembly mandate. We can't tell what, you know, the incoming elected representatives and ministers' departments what to do at that time. So I think we have a tall order in front of us. We have a big job of work to do. Again, from my party's point of view, I want to thank Cameron and the Federation for giving me this opportunity here today, and hopefully we'll deal with some questions from the floor of the room, even though it is late on a Friday afternoon. But again, I do think it is a wee bit, I suppose, frustrating, I'm sure and certain, for all of you, because you know that, you know, from January this year we've had announcements. Maybe it hasn't been an awful lot, you know, evolved publicly since January, and that's, to some extent, I have no doubt, will be a frustration for many of yourselves. So we do need to get a bit of certainty into this. So I want to see the programme board up and running. I want to see that getting a more public persona. I want to see us looking at options, and any discussions that I've had on behalf of my own party with other colleagues, either in the executive or within even the likes of ASIB and other institutions, we're saying, let's look at a clean sheet. There are no predetermined outcomes. There are nothing guaranteed. When people talk about getting rid of the housing executive, that's a term, as I say, I would absolutely disassociate with. And I think it's unfortunate that language has some cases crept in, even if it's more behind the scenes. So I think that we're moving into a period where we have massive opportunities. We have very, very important obligations, as I've said, to meet the need. brilliant opportunities to make sure that all of those sectors that have currently a role can play a role moving on into the future. And as I said, for me, then I just want to say for the record here this afternoon, the programme board, the management of the explorations that Jim outlined, that will be very, very important in the time ahead. But it is important that all the contributors to this debate understand that there are bottom lines for this. There are fundamental principles that need to be enshrined in whatever structures we might agree in the time ahead. So I don't want to be negative, and I'm not going to rain anybody's parade. I'm simply saying is we actually take it, from my party's point of view, we have really a clean slate as to how we move forward, what structures we may look to develop in the time ahead. And all of that will be based upon people making the case, and the case will have to stand over. But I would make a final point, and this is this, that as we do move forward, we do have to understand that there are things that need to be done. We do need to understand that there are very sensitive issues out there around housing, particularly in the past, but even, unfortunately, some of that hasn't entirely left us. We do have to look at the whole issue of shared neighbourhoods and how we take that agenda on as well. But also, as I've said, the fact that we need to make sure that we have the provision of social housing. And I believe very few people will thank us if we take all of the housing currently in public ownership out of public ownership. And I think that's something that people need to bear in mind as we move forward in time ahead. I don't believe that people will thank us kindly. I think Kevin made the point that if you start up a point and nobody likes you, well, if you were to say publicly in this place that in 3, 4 or 5 years' time there'll be no more houses in public ownership, well then definitely nobody like you can take that as a given. Okay, so thanks very, very much.